People would rather transport something by a flight to overseas than to actually do it via land within the continent, because there's so many struggles that come with that. So I think we need to improve a lot in terms of how to actually facilitate trade outside reducing tariffs, which is what the Free Continental Trade Area does, how to actually remove other barriers that are physical that pose a challenge to.
All right. Thank you so much. We are again at the Johannesburg Business School, and right on my left, I'm joined by Primrose Bhima, who is, of course, a political analyst. And, we are attending this event. This is a critical event in the African continent, especially because, since its inception 20 years ago, just yesterday, it was Africa Day, and we're celebrating that day with this event. So, Primrose, maybe let's start with this question, right? On behalf of the AU and other organizations that actually play a role into facilitating the Africa Continental Free Trade project, how far are we? Because 2023 is marked as a year for acceleration of the Africa Continental Free Trade project. How far are we?
So thank you very much for having me. To be quite honest, we are only in the beginning stages. As was mentioned by most speakers, we have all these frameworks, we've got all these aspirations, but trade started, I think, in 2021 under the African Free Continental Trade Area. And of course, it depends on states, taking it up and saying we're going to start trading in this way. And so as it stands, they're trying a lot to mobilize, for example, the business sector, investors, and civil society members, because when you say intra-Africa trade, the people that do trade and business mostly are those people. So there's a lot of trying to facilitate conversations so that people can actually buy in. So the stage we're at is a lot of buy-in. Yeah. Intra-Africa trade is still very low. I think it's about 17% of trade, as in like importing and exporting within the region. Yeah. And I think some of the key challenges that exist are the delays that people experience across borders. People would rather transport something by a flight to overseas than to actually do it via land within the continent, because there's so many struggles that come with that. So I think we need to improve a lot in terms of how to actually facilitate trade outside reducing tariffs, which is what the Free Continental Trade Area does, how to actually remove other barriers that are physical that pose a challenge to traders, investors, and people that are interested in doing business on the continent.
Mm-hmm. You specialize in policy, right? And I usually ask this question to a lot of people who, are champions of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. Whether it's service providers or product manufacturers, with this Africa Continental Free Trade Area, how do we make sure that it's not hijacked? How do we make sure that it's not hijacked by these big companies and they take over this whole Africa's number one dream that we all dream about, and at the end of the day, we end up just having something that is branded Africa, but it's not actually an African product?
Yes, great, thanks. Unfortunately, as you said, I'm a policy analyst. When you talk trade, you're talking business. And yet, like you said, corporations are there to expand and to continue to ensure that if any new threats arise, they actually, squash them or do mergers and all of that. So, for example, if you look at a giant like Coca-Cola, they won't like the fact that they no longer have to import some of the ingredients from Asia and then make Coca-Cola and other products that are distributed within Africa. They're going to be mad when you're giving them the option to say, no, we need to use the ingredients that we have from the continent. So they set the prices. So we will face the challenge, for example, of pricing our own products and wanting people in industry to buy them as opposed to what is cheaper internationally. So I think one of the critical ways to engage is to actually strategize and actually do the mergers, in as much as it will seem like it's hijacked, because the rules for trade have been set, the rules for the global economy have been set. But what we're trying to do is we don't want to be left behind, and also we don't want to continue to be small and dependent. So I think in the short run, like talking about 50 years, that will be a major struggle. We can't just run alone. We are going to have to negotiate the terms and conditions as they are.
So basically, a compromise had to be reached at some point.
Definitely, yes. Perhaps we start with like reducing percentages. For example, what the president of Botswana is doing with the diamonds, it's making people uncomfortable, but trying to say, what, we need greater independence. We need to be able to refine our own products on our own and to set the terms of our engagements. We can't just say this is what has been all along and not try and change the playing field. Yeah. And I think those small attempts eventually will lead to higher percentages of our earnings and how much we retain in terms of what comes out of the African continent.
Yeah. Last but not least, from a policy perspective and coming from a policy background, do you think the AU has achieved their goals in terms of policy and enforcing some of the policies that were actually decided at the AU in the past 20 years?
So there's a very broad question that I can answer in some limited ways. So for example, our major aim is to eradicate poverty. Yeah. And one of the areas has always been indicated as agriculture. 80% of Africans, mostly in rural areas, deal with agriculture, but they need to be empowered. Yeah. So for example, the AU's agricultural project was to say every country must dedicate at least 10% of their national budget to agriculture. But I think so far only like 20 out of 55 states are actively doing that. Number one is because the AU can only recommend, but it does not implement, and it doesn't follow up and say you're not doing this, therefore you need to reform. Yeah. So in terms of the limited authority they have, they've tried to create an incentive and give guidelines, but the member states haven't taken it up. And I think when you speak agriculture, that's a very big one. So if only 20 out of 55 states, for example, have not been active in promoting that, then it means it's a drawback. I can imagine the situation looks harder in other sectors. So to answer your question, is the AU hasn't achieved much when we're saying AU member states, yeah. But that is because they're dragging their feet and not doing what has been said as this is how we can make it better.
Primrose, Bhima, right here at the Johannesburg Business School. And of course, it is at 2 o'clock. We're heading again to the second session, which is going to be the actual book launch. I'm looking forward to actually chatting to more panelists that will be coming through. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you for having me.